Bernard Montgomery didn't whisper his criticisms. He delivered them like briefing notes, confident, precise, and utterly certain he was right. In the winter of 1944, he told Dwight Eisenhower, something that would burn through the Allied command like a lit fuse. American troops, he said, had failed him, not once, twice. The accusation landed at the worst possible moment. The war in the West was supposed to be nearly over. Instead, the Germans had just torn a massive hole through the Allied lines in the Ardennes, and now the men trying to close that hole were being told they weren't good enough. What Montgomery actually said, and why he said it, would poison the relationship between the British and American commands for the rest of the war, and long after it ended. To understand how it got there, you have to go back to what Montgomery believed about himself and about the Americans. Bernard Law Montgomery had been fighting wars since 1914. By the time he took command of the 8th Army in North Africa in 1942, he developed an iron certainty about one thing. Battles were won by preparation, not improvisation. You studied the ground. You built up your supplies. You struck only when you were ready. Then you won. It worked. El Alamein made him a hero. The newspapers called him the Desert Fox's conqueror. Churchill adored him. The British public treated him like a national treasure. The problem was that Montgomery absorbed all of this without modification. By 1944, he genuinely believed he was the finest operational commander the Allies possessed. He wasn't entirely wrong, but he also wasn't entirely right, and he had no mechanism for recognizing the difference. His view of American troops had been forming since Tunisia. He'd watched them stumble at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, taking a brutal mauling from Rommel's armor before Patton arrived to stabilize things. Montgomery filed that away. American soldiers were brave enough, he thought. Their junior officers were capable, but their senior commanders were too optimistic, too rushed, and too unwilling to build the kind of careful, methodical campaigns that actually achieved results. He wasn't alone in thinking this. Many British officers shared the view, but most of them had the sense to keep it to themselves, or at least to soften it diplomatically. Montgomery did not soften things. By the time Operation Overlord launched in June 1944, Montgomery was commanding all Allied ground forces, British, Canadian, and American. Eisenhower was his superior in the overall chain of command, but on the ground in France, the operational decisions flowed through Montgomery. The plan around the city of Caen was where the first friction appeared. Montgomery had always intended the British and Canadian forces to draw German armor toward Caen, keeping pressure on the eastern end of the lodgment. This would allow the Americans to break out on the western end. The strategy made sense. The execution, however, produced weeks of grinding combat around Caen that didn't look like success to American eyes, or to Eisenhower's. Montgomery remained serenely confident throughout. When American generals expressed frustration, he explained patiently that everything was proceeding according to his design. Some of them believed him, others did not. And when Patton's Third Army finally broke out at St. Lo in August, roaring through the Gap and swinging east, the liberation of France moved so fast that the earlier arguments were temporarily forgotten in the excitement. But the arguments didn't disappear. They went underground, waiting. The summer of 1944 had produced another disagreement, one that would directly set up what was coming. Montgomery had proposed what he called a single concentrated thrust, a narrow advance into Germany that would, he believed, end the war before Christmas. He wanted the resources, the supplies, and the command authority concentrated behind his forces in the north. Eisenhower said no. He chose instead a broad front strategy, advancing on multiple axes simultaneously, keeping pressure on the Germans across a wide stretch of territory. Montgomery thought this was wrong. He said so loudly and repeatedly, and in terms that made American commanders feel they were being lectured by a schoolmaster. The argument over Market Garden made things worse. In September 1944, Montgomery launched his ambitious airborne and armored operation to seize a series of bridges in the Netherlands and cross the Rhine. It nearly worked. The British 1st Airborne Division made it to Arnhem. The ground forces, including American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, fought hard to hold the corridor open. But the link-up at Arnhem failed. The 1st Airborne was decimated. Montgomery called it 90% successful. The Americans called it something else. Then came the Ardennes. On December 16, 1944, 3 German armies smashed through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack, Hitler's last great offensive in the West, came with stunning force and speed. Within days, the Germans had penetrated more than 60 miles into Allied territory, creating what the newspapers would call the Battle of the Bulge. The crisis was immediate. Eisenhower's headquarters scrambled to respond. 2 formations stood in the path of the German advance. The 101st Airborne Division, which got surrounded at Bastogne, and various units of the 1st United States Army stretched and battered across a wide front. Here is where the command situation became genuinely complicated, and where Montgomery entered the picture in a way that guaranteed trouble. The German breakthrough had cut the American lines in a way that made it difficult for General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, to communicate with his forces north of the Bulge. Eisenhower made a command decision on December 20th. He temporarily transferred the American 1st Army and the 9th Army, both north of the German penetration, to Montgomery's 21st Army Group. It was a sensible military decision. Montgomery was geographically positioned to coordinate those forces more easily than Bradley. But it handed Montgomery something he'd wanted since Normandy: operational control over American armies. Montgomery moved fast. He arrived at the headquarters of the United States 1st Army on December 21st. General Courtney Hodges, who'd been under enormous strain managing the crisis, reportedly looked shaken. Montgomery, by multiple accounts, swept in like a general, arriving to rescue a disaster zone. Brusque, energetic, reorganizing things, issuing instructions, with the certainty of a man who has never seriously doubted himself. American officers present at these meetings describe the experience with varying degrees of diplomatic restraint in their later accounts. What came through consistently was the feeling that Montgomery treated the American command as though it had been failing before he arrived, and that he intended to fix it. And he didn't keep those impressions private. Montgomery wrote to Field Marshal Allen Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, describing the situation he'd found. The American command, he wrote, was in confusion. The generals were shaken. The situation had required his personal intervention to stabilize. He had similar conversations with his own staff. These assessments filtered back, as such things always do in a headquarters environment, to the Americans. What Montgomery said privately was eventually understood, if not word for word, by the people he'd said it about. But the formal accusation, the one that gave this story its shape, came through a different channel. After the crisis in the North stabilized, after Montgomery had reoriented the American 1st Army and helped prepare the counterattack that would eventually close the Bulge, he held a press conference. On January 7, 1945, Bernard Montgomery spoke to British and American journalists in a way that had no precedent in Allied command relations during the war. He described how the Germans had broken through and created a dangerous situation. He described how he had ridden to the rescue, He spoke about the American soldiers with a combination of praise and condescension that was almost artfully balanced. Brave men, he said, fine fighters who needed proper handling and firm control to achieve their potential. He praised Eisenhower. He praised the team effort. And in doing so, he created the unmistakable impression that the American commanders had failed and that he, Bernard Montgomery, had arrived to sort out the mess. The room was stunned. The British journalists understood immediately what he'd done. Some of the American journalists were furious on the spot. The report that went out over the wires presented Montgomery as the savior of the Bulge, the British general who had rescued the situation after the Americans collapsed. Eisenhower received the reports within hours. The reaction at American headquarters was not quiet. Bradley was incensed. He told Eisenhower that he could not continue to serve under the current arrangement. Patton was characteristically blunt. His diary entries from this period are among the most unfiltered assessments of Montgomery's character in the historical record. But what mattered most was Eisenhower himself. Eisenhower had worked harder than anyone to hold the Allied coalition together. He'd smoothed over arguments between American and British commanders for 2 years. He'd swallowed his own frustrations with Montgomery repeatedly, over Market Garden, over the broad front argument, over the endless requests for more resources and unified command that Montgomery never stopped making. He'd told Marshal and the chiefs of staff on more than one occasion that Montgomery was difficult. What he hadn't done was act on it in any definitive way, because Montgomery was a genuinely capable battlefield commander and the coalition needed to function. The press conference changed the calculation. Eisenhower drafted a message to the combined chiefs of staff. The message was blunt in a way that Eisenhower's communications rarely were. He laid out the situation. He stated that the command arrangement could not continue if it produced this kind of public friction. And he stated, with quiet but unmistakable clarity, that if a choice had to be made between him and Montgomery, the combined chiefs should choose. This was not a small thing. Eisenhower was telling Marshall, Churchill, and Brooke that he was prepared to fire Montgomery, or resign himself, if the press conference behavior continued. The message never had to be sent in its full form. Brooke intervened with Montgomery first. Brooke, who was himself often exasperated by Montgomery, understood the severity of what had just happened. He made clear to Montgomery that he had come close to breaking the coalition. Montgomery, to his credit, acted quickly. He sent Eisenhower a message that was, by his standards, remarkably humble. He said the press conference had been a disaster. He accepted responsibility. He called Eisenhower a great supreme commander and pledged his complete loyalty to the Allied cause. Eisenhower accepted it. The crisis was officially resolved, but it wasn't really resolved because the underlying thing Montgomery believed hadn't changed. He still thought the American command had been in disarray before he arrived. He still thought the broad front strategy was wrong. He still thought he was the better operational commander. The press conference hadn't been an accident or a misstatement. It had been Montgomery saying, in a public forum, what he'd been saying privately for months. Now go back to the title's specific claim. When did Montgomery tell Eisenhower that American troops had failed him? Twice. The first failure, in Montgomery's accounting, was the Ardennes breakthrough itself. In his view, the thinly held American line in the Ardennes reflected poor command judgment. Eisenhower's broad front strategy had spread forces too thin. Bradley's headquarters had failed to respond adequately to intelligence warnings. The result was a German offensive that should have been anticipated and wasn't. Montgomery had said this to Brooke, to his staff, and eventually, by implication, to the press. The second failure was more pointed and more personal. After the northern shoulder of the Bulge was stabilized and Montgomery had control of the American First Army, he planned a counterattack. He wanted to strike when he judged the conditions were right. methodical, prepared, in the tradition of everything he believed about how battles should be fought. The American commanders under him were ready to move faster. Eisenhower and Bradley wanted the counterattack to begin sooner. Montgomery pushed back. He said the forces weren't ready. He requested more time. When the counterattack finally launched, Montgomery's assessment afterward was that the American forces had not performed to the standard he'd expected, given the preparation time he'd insisted on. He put this in communications to Brooke. He raised it indirectly with Eisenhower. The American First Army had, in his judgment, failed to press the advantage with sufficient aggression and coordination. Eisenhower heard this. Bradley heard this. It was the second time in less than a month that the commander of 21st Army Group had told the Supreme Commander that his American troops had come up short. The problem with both accusations was that they were deeply unfair, and Eisenhower knew it. The American soldiers who'd held Bastogne without sufficient supplies, without adequate air cover in the early days, surrounded by German forces that outnumbered them, those men had not failed. The 82nd Airborne, holding the northern shoulder at St. Vith and along the Somme River in brutal winter conditions, they hadn't failed either. The First Army divisions that had absorbed the initial shock of 3 German armies without breaking completely, buying the time that allowed Patton's Third Army to swing north from the south, they'd done something remarkable. Montgomery acknowledged the bravery of individual American soldiers when it suited him. What he consistently refused to acknowledge was that the system, the American system of command, logistics, and combined arms, had also functioned. Not perfectly, not without crisis, but it had functioned well enough to stop Hitler's last offensive in the West, and it had done so largely before Montgomery reorganized anything. The broader truth was something Montgomery could never quite bring himself to accept. The United States Army of late 1944 was not the army that had stumbled at Kasserine Pass in 1943. It had learned, adapted, and professionalized at a pace that few armies in history had matched. Its logistics system was, by almost any objective measure, the most capable on the planet. Its artillery was devastating. Its air support was integrated in ways the German army could only envy. Its junior and mid-level commanders had 2 years of combat experience behind them. Montgomery measured armies by the standard of meticulous preparation and step-by-step advance. The Americans had built something different, a force optimized for speed, adaptability, and exploitation. By Montgomery's metric, they would always look undisciplined. By the metric of winning, they were formidable. Eisenhower understood this. It was, in the end, the core of their disagreement. The January press conference was the moment it became impossible to pretend otherwise. Montgomery had told the world, and told Eisenhower directly through the implications of what he said, that American troops had failed him in the Ardennes and fallen short in the counterattack that followed. Eisenhower chose coalition over confrontation, as he almost always did. He accepted Montgomery's apology. He kept him in command through the Rhine crossing and into Germany. He never fully trusted him again. When the war ended, the American soldiers who'd held Bastogne, who'd bled along the Elsenborn Ridge, who'd driven through the Siegfried Line and across the Rhine, received their victory. Montgomery received a field marshal's baton and a reputation that he spent the rest of his life defending with the same intensity he'd spent the war defending his own judgment. He published his memoirs in 1958 and managed, impressively, to reignite almost every argument he'd had during the war, including the ones about American competence. Some men learn from the reactions of the people around them. Montgomery learned from his victories. The 2 accusations he delivered to Eisenhower were a window into something deeper than arrogance. They revealed a commander who genuinely couldn't see what he was looking at, even when it was standing right in front of him, covered in snow and holding the line.